There are moments in war when the next chapter does not announce itself with a declaration. It appears quietly, as a ship changing course, as a map zooming in on a place most of the world had never heard of, as a question that sounds small at first and then suddenly feels connected to everything. Right now, that place is Kharg Island, and that question is no longer just whether it can be struck, it is whether it can be taken, and what the world would become if it is. The war that began on February 28th has already widened into a crisis touching shipping, oil, insurance, and global energy security, with the International Energy Agency calling it the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market, and the International Maritime Organization warning of severe consequences for seafarers and commercial navigation around Hormuz. At first glance, Kharg does not look like the center of a global story. It is a small Iranian island in the Persian Gulf. But small places become dangerous when too much depends on them. Before this war, Kharg handled roughly 80 to 90% of Iran's crude exports. That means it is not simply a military target. It is a pressure point between war and the world economy. Public reporting says the United States has already struck military targets on the island, while avoiding the oil export infrastructure itself. A revealing decision because it suggests Washington wants leverage over Iran without detonating the full economic consequences of destroying the island's energy systems. And that is where this story changes. Because once you decide not to destroy an objective, a different idea enters the room. If you do not want to burn it, maybe you want to control it. If you do not want to erase it, maybe you want to hold it. And if you want to pressure Iran without invading the mainland, Kharg begins to look like the kind of answer that tempts decision-makers precisely because it seems limited. Public reporting from Axios says the Trump administration is considering whether Kharg should be occupied or blockaded in order to force the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. That matters because it moves the discussion beyond airstrikes and into the realm of boots on Iranian territory, even if that territory sits offshore. This is the strategic seduction of Kharg Island. It looks like a compromise. Not Tehran, not a march inland, not a war of cities and mass occupation. Just one island, one export hub, one artery of revenue. One piece of terrain that might be seized, defended, and then used as bargaining power. But modern war punishes clean-looking ideas. And Kharg only looks clean if you view it in isolation. The moment you connect it to the Strait of Hormuz, to tanker insurance, to LNG flows, to Asian import dependence, to the credibility of American power, and to Iran's ability to retaliate across the Gulf, the island stops being a limited option and starts looking like the opening of a much larger problem. The IEA notes that Hormuz is also critical for LNG flows, including a major share of Asia's imports, which is why disruption there is not just a regional concern. That is why the Marines matter. Because once an island becomes a military option, people start asking the same hard question: who would actually do it? And right now, the answer everyone is watching is the same: the Marine Expeditionary Unit. The USS Tripoli, the amphibious force that does not move by accident. Public reporting says the U.S. has sent the USS Tripoli and its embarked Marine force toward the Middle East, while additional Marines and amphibious ships are also being moved into the region. Axios reports a 2,500-strong Marine unit is expected to deploy, with 2 more units also heading toward the theater. And AP has separately reported additional amphibious ships and Marines being sent as the crisis deepens. Now, in the narrow military sense, this is not fantasy. A Marine Expeditionary Unit exists for rapid response, crisis entry, amphibious operations, raids, evacuations, and limited contingencies. The 31st MEU is described by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command as the Marine Corps' only continuously forward-deployed MEU, and a flexible force able to perform a wide range of operations, while the broader ARG/MEU structure can bring more than 5,000 Marines and sailors into a contingency. USS Tripoli, An America-class amphibious assault ship is also explicitly built for aviation-heavy operations, including fixed-wing F-35B activity. In plain language, the force package for a fast, hard, politically charged island operation does exist. But that is only the beginning of the truth, because the most misleading sentence in war is often the simplest one. They can take it. Yes, they probably can. The harder question is whether they can hold it, sustain it, and survive what comes after. That is where the story darkens. A crisis response force is not the same thing as a long-term occupation force, and Kharg would not be held in a vacuum. It would be held within reach of Iranian missiles, drones, naval mines, coastal systems, and every retaliatory tool Tehran believes it can use without giving up. Public reporting already describes Iranian control over Hormuz as a continuing chokehold, while separate Axios reporting notes that U.S. forces have been targeting Iran's mine-laying capability precisely because those mines could make commercial transit almost impossible. This is the central illusion behind any Kharg operation, that seizing the island would solve the crisis that created the island's importance. But Kharg is not the Strait of Hormuz. It is tied to Hormuz, dependent on Hormuz, strategically inseparable from Hormuz. Yet it is not the strait itself. And that distinction matters, because tankers do not return simply because a flag changes over one piece of land. The IEA says that restoring flows depends not only on oil availability, but on adequate physical protection for shipping and functioning insurance mechanisms, while the IMO has urged extreme caution and even advised vessels to avoid the region where possible until conditions improve. In other words, Kharg can become leverage, but it cannot by itself restore trust in the waterway. And that brings us to the economic layer, the layer that makes this story global. Because this war is no longer only being measured in targets hit or missiles intercepted, it is being measured in flows interrupted, in ships rerouted, in insurance premiums repriced, in fuel costs transmitted into real economies far from the Gulf. The IEA's March report says flows through Hormuz plunged from around 20 million barrels per day before the war to a trickle, calling this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. It has already triggered the largest emergency stock release the agency has ever coordinated, and the IEA has warned that these steps are only a stopgap if shipping disruption continues. That is why Washington has not acted like this is merely a battlefield issue. It has acted like this is a system issue. A crisis in which military action, maritime security, and market stabilization all have to move together. That is also why the administration appears to be searching for something broader than a unilateral strike package. Axios has reported that Trump has been trying to build a so-called Hormuz coalition, because any serious attempt to reopen commercial traffic requires not only military force, but political backing, shared burden, and confidence that the world will continue to use the route once the shooting pauses. The problem is that coalitions are easier to announce than to operate, especially when the mission risks sliding from escorting ships into confronting Iran directly. So what happens next? The first and most likely path is continued pressure without immediate occupation. More strikes on Iranian military assets connected to maritime coercion. More naval and amphibious positioning. More mine hunting and route protection. More efforts to convince insurers, shippers, and allied governments that commercial movement can resume. This remains the most likely near-term path, because it preserves escalation options while avoiding the enormous political threshold of putting American ground forces on Iranian territory. That is an inference based on the current reporting. Washington is clearly preparing options, but public reporting also says no final Kharg decision has been made. The second path is a limited Kharg operation, not a march on Iran, not the opening of a conventional invasion, but a raid, blockade, or temporary occupation framed as a narrow strategic move. This is the scenario that now feels plausible enough to discuss seriously, because it is already being discussed publicly. If the White House concludes that Hormuz will not reopen through pressure alone, and if energy disruption continues to tighten the global system, then Kharg becomes more attractive precisely because it promises visible leverage. But even here, the danger remains the same. A limited seizure is only limited until Iran decides the response will be regional, maritime, and continuous. The third path is the darkest one. A war of expanding retaliation. Kharg struck. Hormuz contested. Tankers still absent. Regional bases under threat. Commercial crews trapped between state decisions and military signaling. The IMO has already recorded fatalities and injuries involving merchant shipping and maritime crews, and it convened an extraordinary council session specifically because the situation had grown severe enough to threaten international shipping safety on a systemic level. If that trajectory continues, then the question stops being, can the Marines take Kharg, and becomes, can the international system absorb a longer war around its most sensitive energy choke point? My own forecast is this. If the current trajectory holds, the United States is more likely in the next 1 to 3 weeks to keep building pressure around Kharg than to launch an immediate, full occupation. That means more preparation, more signaling, more maritime coercion, and more efforts to reopen shipping without crossing the final threshold. But if Hormuz remains functionally closed, if oil pressure worsens, and if Washington concludes that air and naval pressure alone cannot change Tehran's calculus, then the odds of a limited operation against Kharg rise sharply. That forecast is an inference from current public reporting, not a confirmed plan. And that is the final truth of Kharg Island. Its danger is not that it is too large to control. Its danger is that it is small enough to tempt leaders into thinking control would be simple. A single island, a single flag, a single operation, a single demonstration of power. But war does not respect neat categories, and Kharg is connected to too many things: oil, LNG, shipping, alliances, inflation, retaliation, credibility, to remain only an island for long. So, can the U.S. really take Kharg Island? In the narrow military sense, yes, probably. The platforms exist, the Marines exist, the capability exists. But the real question was never whether Kharg could be taken. The real question is whether taking it would solve anything larger than Kharg itself. And unless Washington has an answer for everything the island is connected to, then the moment American boots touch that ground may be the moment this war stops looking limited and starts looking like the beginning of something much harder to end. Because in modern war, the hardest part is not taking the objective, it is surviving everything the objective is connected to.